July 1916. The muddy trenches of the Somme. Thousands of soldiers wait in the dark, damp earth. The artillery barrage was about to lift. An officer checks a small dial strapped to his wrist. Not a bulky pocket watch, a wristlet. The signal comes. They go over the top. The synchronized slaughter of the First World War was orchestrated not by grand clocks in town squares, but by a tiny ticking machine tied to the wrist. This was 1916. But the story of the watch begins nearly 500 years earlier. It begins in the early 1500s in the freezing, metal-rich city of Nuremberg, Germany. The towering clocks of Europe were marvels of iron, driven by massive weights that slowly pulled down with gravity. They were anchored to walls and towers. You could not put a tower in your pocket. The breakthrough required a completely different way to store energy. They did not know the word physics in the modern sense, but they understood metallurgy. A locksmith named Peter Henlin, working in the early 16th century, took a tightly coiled ribbon of steel, the mainspring, and used its unwinding tension to power a tiny gear train. They encased these early movements in brass and ornamented them with intricate engravings. They were small, spherical objects, often worn on a chain around the neck or attached to clothing. They were called Nuremberg eggs. But these early watches had a massive flaw. They were notoriously inaccurate. If you owned one, you were lucky if it kept time within a couple of hours a day. They did not even have minute hands, just a single hour hand pointing roughly at a number. The mechanism was constantly losing its rhythm. But the seed was planted. The clock had left the tower. The next challenge was making it actually tell the right time. And the solution would come from the most dangerous workplace on Earth. The open ocean in the 1700s was a death trap. Ships navigated by the stars, calculating latitude with reasonable accuracy. But longitude, the east-west position, was a deadly guessing game. A miscalculation meant crashing into rocks in the dead of night. The British Empire, expanding across the globe, realized that controlling the oceans meant controlling time. If a ship carried a clock set to the exact time in London and compared it to local noon, determined by the sun, they could calculate their exact longitude. The British government offered a prize of £20,000, roughly $4 million in modern currency, to anyone who could solve the longitude problem. John Harrison, a carpenter turned clockmaker, built a marine chronometer that lost only 5 seconds over an 80-day voyage. It was a mechanical masterpiece. The British Royal Navy equipped its fleets with these precise timekeepers. It was the technological edge that allowed a small island to project power across every ocean, building an empire where the sun never set. Precision timekeeping had become a weapon of state. But these machines were still heavy, boxed instruments. They belonged on the deck of a ship, not on a person. The technology needed to shrink. And the catalyst for that shrinking would come from a completely unexpected social circle. By the mid-1800s, the pocket watch had become the standard for gentlemen. Railroads were stitching continents together, and schedules demanded precise timekeeping. But women did not wear trousers. They wore dresses with no practical pockets. If a woman wanted to know the time, she had to ask a man or find a public clock. Watchmakers in Switzerland and France saw a niche market. They took small pocket watch movements, attached them to leather straps, and sold them to wealthy women. They called them wristlets. They were delicate, covered in precious stones, and powered by tiny movements. The technology was essentially the same as a pocket watch, just downscaled and mounted on a strap. That decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The upper class bought them as jewelry. They were fragile, susceptible to dust, moisture, and the constant shock of human movement. Jewelers laughed at the idea of a serious mechanism being subjected to the violent motion of a human arm. Men, in particular, dismissed them entirely. A real man pulled a heavy chain from his vest, flipped open a silver case, and checked the time with authority. Strapping a tiny clock to your arm was seen as effeminate, a fashion fad that would surely fade. The wristwatch was a toy. It was a novelty for women who could not be trusted with real instruments. The watch industry was perfectly happy making pocket watches. But the world was about to change in a way that would make pocket watches completely useless. The turn of the 20th century brought a new kind of conflict. The Boer War in South Africa and the early colonial skirmishes proved that war was no longer fought in neat lines across open fields. Cavalry charges were disappearing. Soldiers were hiding in trenches, coordinating movements over vast distances using telegraphs and signaling flags. An officer riding a horse could not safely pull a pocket watch from his vest while being shot at. The Boer War changed everything, or at least it should have. Officers started buying cheap leather straps, looping them through the lugs of their pocket watches and wearing them on their wrists. It was a crude, desperate field modification. When these officers returned to polite society in London and Paris, they were openly mocked. High society still viewed the wristlet as a piece of jewelry. Military men wearing them were considered eccentric at best, cowardly at worst. Watchmakers refused to manufacture them for men. They believed the public would never buy a man's watch on a strap. There was a deep superstition in the industry that a watch exposed to the elements would inevitably fail. The human arm moved too fast, sweated too much, and bumped into too many things. The delicate balance wheel inside the movement would surely shatter. The wristwatch was fighting a war on two fronts. The public thought it was silly. The manufacturers thought it was technically impossible to make durable. The old guard was stubborn. They preferred the solid click of a pocket watch case. They preferred tradition. But tradition was about to be obliterated by artillery fire. August 1914, the First World War began. The Western Front became a static nightmare of mud, barbed wire, and machine guns. Success depended entirely on coordination. An artillery barrage needed to lift at the exact second the infantry left the trenches. If the timing was off by even 30 seconds, the infantry would be cut down by their own guns, or the enemy would have time to man their machine guns. You could not coordinate this with pocket watches. An officer leading men over the top had his hands full with a pistol, a whistle, and a map. He needed the time on his wrist. The military demand exploded overnight. Watchmakers could no longer ignore the market. Companies like Rolex, Omega, and Cartier pivoted aggressively. They developed rugged watches with luminous dials so they could be read in the dark trenches. They added metal grids over the glass to prevent shattering. These were called trench watches. And here is where the story gets dark. The wristwatch did not become popular because it was convenient. It became popular because it was a tool for killing. It synchronized death. Millions of young men were issued or bought these watches before facing the machine guns. When the armistice was signed in 1918, millions of soldiers returned home. They had worn watches on their wrists for 4 years of hell. They were not going to stop. The stigma was gone. The wristwatch was no longer a feminine novelty. It was a badge of survival. It was the mark of a man who had seen the horrors of modern war. The pocket watch industry collapsed almost overnight. The wristwatch had won. If you are finding this history interesting, subscribe to the channel. Here at Common Lore, we tell stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. The interwar period saw the wristwatch reshape global society. Aviation was the new frontier. Pilots like Charles Lindbergh needed precise timing to calculate fuel consumption and navigation over featureless oceans. The wristwatch became the ultimate instrument of the modern age. It dictated factory shifts, train schedules, and radio broadcasts. Time was no longer something you checked. It was something you carried with you, constantly reminding you of the next task, the next movement, the next deadline. By the time the Second World War erupted, the wristwatch was standard military issue. The United States government ordered millions of watches, designating specific technical specifications like the A11 hack watch. It had a special mechanism that stopped the second hand when the crown was pulled out, allowing soldiers to synchronize their watches down to the exact second before a paratrooper drop or a beach landing. The global economy shifted to accommodate this. Switzerland solidified its monopoly on mechanical movements, exporting millions of precision instruments worldwide. The wristwatch had become the invisible dictator of the industrialized world. Human life was now strictly segmented into seconds, and everyone had the device to enforce it strapped to their body. It was absolute control. But the mechanical era was approaching its limit. December 1969. The world shifted again. A Japanese company called Seiko introduced the Astron, the first quartz wristwatch. Instead of a ticking balance wheel, it used a tiny battery sending an electrical current through a quartz crystal. The crystal vibrated 32,768 times per second. The watch was accurate to within a few seconds a month, not a day. This was the quartz crisis. The Swiss mechanical watch industry, complacent in its centuries-old tradition, was decimated. Hundreds of watchmakers went bankrupt. Tens of thousands of craftsmen lost their jobs. The wristwatch transitioned from a delicate mechanical marvel to a cheap, disposable piece of electronics. By the 1980s, you could buy a watch for $10 that kept better time than a $5,000 Swiss masterpiece. The scale became unimaginable. Today, over 1 billion watches are produced annually. But that is the part that catches people off guard. Despite the digital revolution, the mechanical watch survived. It adapted. It became a symbol of status, a piece of wearable art, an investment, and the uses expanded far beyond telling time. Smartwatches now monitor heart rates, track sleep, and pay for groceries. They are essentially small computers. Yet, the classic mechanical watch remains, a stubborn relic of a bygone era that refuses to die. It was ignored. It was mocked. It was worn as a joke by society women. It synchronized the slaughter of the Somme. It navigated bombers over Europe. It sat on the wrists of astronauts as they stepped onto the moon. And now, it sits on your wrist. Or perhaps it sits on your nightstand, quietly ticking in the dark. The watch did not just put time on your wrist. It put time inside your mind. It took the vast, unending river of existence and chopped it into seconds. It made you accountable to the clock. It made the modern world possible, with all its brutal efficiency and relentless pace. We look at our wrists hundreds of times a day, rarely thinking about the centuries of war, ingenuity, and social revolution wrapped around that small dial. Time was once dictated by the sun and the church bells. Now it is strapped to your skin. It is always there, and it is always watching. If this story surprised you, subscribe to Common Law and tell us in the comments which part of the history of the watch surprised you the most. And leave your like so more people can find this video.